I'm Michael McMullan. Welcome once again to the WPBSA official podcast. And my guest in this episode is someone who's very often heard talking about all sorts of things to do with the game, but who we very rarely hear speaking about a playing career, which for a time, for a few years in fact, made him a top 32 player in the world. It's the WPBSA chairman, Jason Ferguson. Jason, how are you?
I'm very well, Michael. Pleasure to speak to you today.
Absolutely. Really looking forward to reminiscing about your life on the bays. And we're going to go back to the very beginning of it. And we obviously can't go any further back than when you were born. It was 1969, an absolutely colossal year, Jason, in the game's history. It was the year when John Spencer won what's now generally regarded as the first modern world championship. It was the year when Pot Black was first shown on BBC, which is widely regarded as the very beginning of snooker's television age, particularly in Britain. So you and snooker grew up together, really. When did you first become aware of the game?
Well, I guess it appeared just very, very gently in my life. And thanks for reminding me how old I am, Michael.
Not
So,
far behind
yeah,
you.
1969. Yeah, it was a year. I think it was the year that we landed on the moon as well, I think, in that year.
That's right, yeah.
So, so yeah, it was a very different life, I guess, being born where I was born and growing up where I grew up to the sort of life that I see today. And I was born in a mining town in Mansfield, and
Mm.
Mansfield was a very heavy industry town. It was surrounded by coal mines and factories, and actually everybody in that town either went down the mine or went to the factory. That was really how it was. My mum folded jumpers for Marks and Spencers. Worked
Mm.
in what was called Mansfield Hosiery Mills, and worked very hard. My father was a coal-faced miner. He crawled on his hands and knees, in a tunnel 18 inches high, digging coal. And so I was born into this heavy industry town, and growing up there, it was through the 70s. It was very different, but it was interesting. One of the things that happened to me in my life was, I guess, a lot of miners went to Butlins for holidays. There was very often there were certain weeks of the year, and people would go to Butlins holiday camps. And of course, during that time, Butlins camps were booming, and there were places to go. And I went to a holiday camp in Pwllheli in North Wales,
Mm.
Butlins holiday camp there, and I would have been about, I don't know, maybe around 10, I would think. 10, 11, maybe. Well, I was pretty late for, I guess, for by today's standards. And I remember walking into this huge billiard room, and I was completely mesmerized as a child. These balls clicking around, and what is this? And it was just the most amazing thing. And I just instantly fell in love with this game. And I wasn't I didn't play a lot of football at school, and I wasn't really involved in a lot of other things. But this game really captured me. And I think I drove my father crazy all week that week, saying, Dad, the billiard hall, the billiard, and we were in there all the time, and I just couldn't leave it alone. And so that was really my first time of seeing snooker. And the amazing thing is, I walk into our venues now, and I see this game. I absolutely love this game, and I get that same feeling is still there. That this game is so fascinating, and we're all mesmerized by it. That's why we follow it so closely.
I know for kids born in the 60s and 70s, and this applies to me as well, the story of how they got into the game is they saw it on television, or in your case, saw it at a holiday camp for the first time, and then got a little miniature table to start playing on at home. Now, for most people, that meant going out and buying one, or their parents going out and buying one, I guess. But your dad actually took a more direct approach, didn't he?
He did. In fact, coming back from that little trip in Pwllheli in North
Yeah.
Wales, coming back from that trip from Pwllheli in North Wales, from that Butlins holiday camp. We lived on a street, and I had an aunt who lived across the road, and she had a small table in the house. It was 5 feet, 5 feet, and it was really tiny balls on it, and it was gifted to me as a child. And so there I was. I had this little table balanced on two chairs in our living room, and I was getting up. I've always been an early riser. Okay, so I see a lot of 5 a.m.s these days going out of the house and so on. And I was the same as a child. I was always up, and I was playing snooker early morning, and I loved it so much. And I became quite good even on this little table. I was starting to score breaks, and it became a little thing between me and my dad playing snooker. And my dad realized, he said, he realized that I needed to probably improve the conditions if I was going to improve as a player. And of course, snooker was now on television. We used to watch Pot Black. And my memories of Pot Black, again, with my father, were he worked night shifts every night. And it was always, I think it was 9 o'clock. I think if my memory serves me right, I think it was 9 o'clock at night. And this was, I would wait for my father to get up. He would get up and he'd be getting ready for work to go on the night shift. And we used to sit and watch Pot Black before he went to work. And so as time went on, my dad was just born years before his time, really. And how he didn't do other things in his life is a mystery because he was a genius. He could make anything, he could think any problem out. He was a brilliant mathematician. He was a really, really intelligent guy. But anyway, he set to work in our garage at home and went in there and started to make a new snooker table. He'd seen some dimensions on it in a magazine, and he'd started to make this snooker table out of timber, and it was a thick base. Made the cushions himself. He was a great joiner, and it had all the little things you needed. The really good quality cushions. He ordered some rubber. He ordered some cloth online, but not online then. He ordered some cloth from a magazine, and so they're in this kit form. He built this small table that produced really good playing conditions. The balls were almost full size, and the pockets were very tight. The cushions played well, and it was on a metal frame, and the table folded down on its side, and it was on wheels, and it pushed against the wall behind the sofa in the living room. And I used to pull that out in the morning and pull the legs out, and the sofa would push underneath. And this was my training base for many years, really. It was 6 foot by 3, which was the probably slightly too big for the room it was in at the time, but it was just right. I could play and practice, and I trained on that table for so long. Um, and the amazing thing was that years later in my career as an administrator, we were working with Chris Lovell, our head of coaching and training, and we were looking at cues into schools. What can we do for schools? And I said to Chris, I said, I had just the thing at home for this. We need a folding table that folds down on its side and it's on wheels and we can put it away in a cupboard at the end of the day in the school classroom. I said, leave it with me. So I took the concept that I had from my father as a child, took it to Xingpai with Pete Godwin, who was the designer of the table, the Xingpai table at the time. I said, Pete and the Xingpai team, I said, I want to produce this because I think we can send these out all over the world and put them into schools. And basically, the table that we now see in Q Zone, which is the little star table we call it, is actually a replica of the table my father made for me um, as a child. It is almost identical in every way. And for me, it's been every time I see it, obviously I think about my dad, but I also see a lot of children playing on those tables, and it's a lot of fun, and it's just great because it's fun, it's good, the table plays well, and it's not ridiculously expensive where it's not slate bed or anything like that. So yeah, it was quite a thing really, I guess, in my life.
Yeah, and people will be familiar with what you're talking about because we often see these at some of the big venues, those tables you're referring to. But you moved on, obviously, from that to play at a much higher level. And the Midlands of England has always been a huge place for snooker. It's just embedded so much in the culture. And in the 1980s, the quality of players in the Midlands of England on the amateur scene was absolutely unprecedented and just like nothing else we've ever seen, really, in Britain.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of that talent went on to do very well in the sport. And, during that period in my area, of course, I mentioned I grew up in a mining town. We had miners' welfares, we had working men's clubs, we had conservative clubs. There were little clubs all over the place. And what you had there was infrastructure of leagues. And what that meant was there was places to go. The difficulty for me, being a junior at the time, was clubs back then, you had to be 16 years of age to go in them. So actually, training on that small table at home was a real godsend to me to be able to do that. But eventually they would let you go in with your parent and play in the leagues. And the Mansfield League was where I started, Mansfield and District Snooker League, and Bill Werbenick Snooker Club, which actually was the home of the late Lee Spick as well. I saw his name pop up in the last few weeks. Um, and I actually, played in those leagues, but there were other leagues going on. Chesterfield League still going strong. A lot of good players came out of there. Nigel Bond being one. Uh, and then we had a league in Nottingham. The Nottingham Super League was the league of all leagues. Now, This league was about it was two frames each. It wasn't the normal league. You normally have four players in a team and one frame each on a league night. This was two frames each, and it was really the best players who they could find in the area for those clubs. I played for Riley's Snooker Club, and Riley's team was just around the corner from where we were. Riley's was Gary Wilkinson. He was number five in the world at the time. He just won the world match play. Tony Jones, I think he was about number 13 or 14 in the world at the time as well. But he'd won the European Open as a major ranking event. And there was myself. I was in the top 32 at the time, 28 in the world, I think. And then we had about three or four other pros in the team who you could pull in for a league night. So league night was the night. We used to play another club down the road, Pegasus, Anthony Hamilton, I knew a lot of players in Nottingham. A lot of great players came out of those leagues. Michael Holt, still on the tour today, again, played in Nottingham Super League. Amazing, really, to consider the standard. And the amazing thing was that we didn't even win the league. Our team, we had a team with two players, one player in the top eight, one player in the top 16, and a few other players who were in the top 32 and 64. We did not even win the league. We were beaten in the final one year, I remember, and we were beaten by the Corn Exchange, which was a club in Derby. And that was Dave Rowe, Munraj Pal, again, a whole list of pros who were at the top of the game. So the league night, Wednesday night, league night, Nottingham Super League was an unbelievable standard. And very regular, you would go to those league nights, and there would be multiple century breaks, and it's a great training ground, really. And I think a lot of players came out of that very well.
It was great for you in the era that you were becoming an established good amateur player, Jason, that there were more international opportunities, and the World Under 21 Championship started in 1987. And a couple of years later, you ended up getting to the final of it. Now, at that time, particularly, that was an extremely difficult thing to do. But in the final, you came up against someone who was pretty much the best amateur player in the world at the time, in Ken Doherty.
Yeah, that's right. It's a great memory for me. I was under 21, and it was in Iceland in Reykjavik.
Mm.
And I remember it was my first time I'd ever traveled abroad. I've lost count of how many times I've traveled nowadays and where I've been, but
You're
actually,
hardly ever in England now.
yeah, I mean, I hadn't traveled anywhere, so to go to Iceland as a young player, I had a very good person who helped me locally, a man called Ray Shilling. Ray Shilling had a snooker club in my town, and he was a former property developer from London, and he looked after me a little bit when I was younger, and he actually raised the funds to send me to that event. Otherwise, I probably would never have made it. I will say, actually, Ray was also the person that taught me to read balance sheets, do VAT returns, do cash flow forecasting. He was a great influence in my life, Ray Shilling, and still very much in touch with all the family. But actually, I went to that event in Iceland, and I was probably at a level then when I was knocking on the door of turning professional. I was playing in the Pro Ticket series. I'd done well in the Pro Ticket. Leading up to that, I'd won the Pontins in 1988. I won the Pontins at Prestatyn. That was probably considered one of the biggest amateur events in the world at the time. And that really, I was really on the edge, and I've been in those last few qualifiers of turning pro. But to travel to Iceland with my good friend Ken Doherty and the rest of the guys that were there was a great experience. It was new. It was the first time I'd ever really gone out into an arena and played in front of some television cameras with a crowd, and it was a great experience. And I remember getting through to the semi-finals, and I drew Peter Ebdon. I remember this match well. I played Peter Ebdon in the semi-finals, a match which I think I won 9-3. Don't quote me on that, but I think I won that match 9-3. I played very well, and at this point, I was improving all the time. I was getting better all the time, but there was a lot of activity. There was a lot of events to play, and came up against Ken Doherty. My memory of the final was Ken was absolutely the stronger player in the final, and he ran away and beat me in that match. And I remember the one thing of Ken, he got up and made a speech live after the final as a young player. And I thought, wow, it's a good job I didn't win. It was just unbelievable. He was the consummate professional. And I thought, fair play to you, Ken. And he went on to win, he won the World Under 21, he won the World Amateur. and went on to win the world professional. I mean, what a career, and still chipping away at everybody now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you did turn pro, a lot of guys struggle. They've got great amateur records, but they find the pro game is a very different way of playing and they can't step up to it. But you actually did pretty well pretty quickly. I know James Watanabe was one of your first opponents, and he was already a very established player, and you actually beat him. You beat Kirk Stevens, who was still around at the time and had been a top player just a few years before. And then, of course, once you get into your sort of second and third season, we were into the era of all those qualifiers in Stoke and Blackpool, where it would just go on all summer. So, what was it like turning pro at that time, and how did you make that adjustment to
Uh,
the professional
yeah, I mean,
circuit?
I got through the qualifiers. We had like the pro ticket playoffs, so you had to get into the top few players in the pro ticket playoffs. Not dissimilar to the Q Tour today, so where you play in a
Mm.
series of events. Obviously, it's a much bigger tour now. I was in that pro ticket playoff, got through finally, almost lost the last qualifying match against the professional. I won through against the amateurs, and there were only 8 players allowed to turn professional at the time per year, and the top 8 had to play a bottom 8 professional in order to qualify. And I drew a player called Billy Kelly, who I'm sure you'll know.
Irishman, yeah.
Hey, it turned out he was an unbelievable player. He opened up, he made big breaks in the first session, and I was losing. I was 7-5 down in that match, in a best of 19. And eventually I won the last 5 frames and played very well to finish. And it was a great day. It was my 21st birthday. It was the
Wow.
31st of May, 1990. And so the 1st of June, at 21 years of age, I joined the Professional World Snooker Tour. And I walked in, the events basically started the following day. There was like a day and you were straight into it, and I started. And for me, it was quite a lonely experience because I'd gone from playing 4 events a week. You talk about James Watner, we used to play together
Mm.
every week in competitions. I had a good record against him. It was an experience where I walked into World Snooker's situation, or WPBSA as it was at the time. And most of my friends had been knocked out in the qualifiers. So I was pretty lonely. There wasn't the introduction and welcome. And, it was a pretty lonely place for a young snooker player. So I got in and got on with it. I didn't settle too well in first one. In year one, I had a few good results, but year two, I started to really get my head down and push on. And then eventually, I think where I really broke through, we had the qualifiers. You may remember at Stoke-on-Trent, Trentham Gardens. And for me, that was a year where I was probably playing some of my best snooker. And I actually broke the world record that year for the most consecutive frames won in the World Championship. I lost the first frame, won 10-1. I won my next match 10-0. And I think I was 7-0 up in the next match. And I was scoring heavily. I was taking a lot of shots on and scoring heavily. And it was a record that was broken by Ronnie O'Sullivan eventually when they opened the game up and threw all those matches in the qualifiers. So yeah, I moved on and pushed on quite well and got in the top 64, eventually got in the top 32. But it was a slow process. Back then, there were lots of seeding bandings. There was lots of protection in the ranking system for players that were seeded through. It was actually quite hard to progress in those early days. And then enjoyed 4 years in the top 32. And I think at that time, there were times when perhaps if with absolute focus, I could have pushed on a lot further. But there were only 6 or 7 events a year. I've got a bit of an active mind. I was doing other things as well. And, I got involved in administration. And so, I got a little bit distracted, but I loved every minute of my playing career, really. I love the game.
It was a great era, really, that you're talking about your years in the top 32, Jason, because you got into it after only 3 years. And I mean, that's a considerable achievement. You stayed there for a few years in the 32. But I always think that was actually, for me, the best time in the game because you had Stephen Hendry in his absolute prime. The class of 92 were coming through and becoming top players. So many other new faces. Ken Doherty, who we mentioned, Alan McManus, Peter Ebdon, Nigel Bond, all of these guys. Steve Davis, Jimmy White, John Parrott, they were still very good. And even going back to the earlier generation of guys like Dennis Taylor, Terry Griffiths, Cliff Thorburn, they were still around and getting results. It was an amazing era for the game. It was like all the different phases of the professional game all together at once and so hard to actually make any progress. So to actually be in the top 32 and be part of all that for those few years, that's quite something in itself.
Yes, it was a really interesting time, Michael. There was the establishment of the great players, and there was this influx of new talent that was starting to break through from what was a very vibrant amateur game at the time. And some players went on brilliantly. We mentioned Ken Doherty earlier, and he really pushed on. And yeah, for me, bit of steady progress. Got in top 32. And some of those players were really nice to me. I mean, I had a great relationship with Alex Higgins, for example, which it was kind of I guess in later years, quite sad that the way things ended. And I think people thought that it was a bit WPBSA and Alex was a problem. But my personal relationship with Alex was very good, and he was very nice to me. And I remember Terry Griffiths being very nice to me as well. Terry was a wonderful human being, and God rest his soul. He was a lovely man. And actually, he was the one responsible for asking me to get involved in the administration. But I had a few tough battles with Terry on the table. What a player. And overall, it was great to play in that era. It was also an era where you were playing against your heroes.
Mm.
Steve Davis was my hero growing up, and I think like many, everybody was trying to perfect this technique that he seemed to have mastered. And Stephen Hendry, of course, came along, and as Steve would put it, ruined his life and started winning everything. And Stephen was a real tough competitor, and a few battles with Stephen over the years, and he was just for me just an out and out winner. He would win games from the most incredible positions. He really would. So yeah, it was a great time to play, and those stars that you'd watched, some of them I'd watched on Pot Black as a young child, and that were still around, and it was a really fascinating time. And the other thing is they were all entertainers. The players were great entertainers. They knew how to speak, tell a few stories, do a load of trick shots, and I learned a lot in that period.
Let's talk about your World Championship history, Jason, because it was eventful, very eventful. In fact, the times you went there, it was always quite dramatic and all sorts of things happened. And you actually qualified for the World Championship in only your second season. You had to win five best of 19s to get there. You beat some very good players, Tony Mio, Silvino Francisco, both former British Open champions along the way. What was that like when that dream that everyone has when they start out, winning titles is far off in the distance. So the early dream is, I really want to play at the Crucible. Now it's become a reality for you at a young age, quite early in your career. Can you remember, once you got that last qualifier out of the way, what that felt like and the realization that it really was going to happen?
Yeah, it was incredible, really. I mean, even today, I watch the players in those qualifying rounds when we're running Judgment Day and things. It means so much to pot those last few balls and actually make it to that one final stage. The Crucible Theatre in Sheffield, and for me, that was an emotional thing. Again, I can relate to my father being with me, and the
Mm.
happiness that brought within the family, and. Yeah, I went out to play and played Neil Foulds there. Correct me if
Yeah.
I'm wrong, but I think I played Neil Foulds. And
Yes, you did. And the thing to say about Neil Jason is a few years earlier, he'd been right up there at number three in the world. Then he'd gone through a bit of a slump. By the time you played him, he was right back up among the very best players, and you ran him so close.
yeah, I remember coming out into the Crucible. The feeling for me was when I came out to the Crucible, rabbit in the headlights, I think they call it these days. And it for me, this was a whole new environment and the intensity of it. And the thing that strikes you when you walk down those steps of the Crucible into that arena is just how intense it is and how close the audience is to the table. You almost feel like you're playing back in a small working men's club or something where you've got people so close to you and you're asking them to move. That's how it feels. It's not that way. It's an incredible arena, but the intensity is there. So that I was really so nervous to start with in that match, and I got behind in the game. And I remember, I'd got friends and family there, and it was all looking like disaster in the first half. And I got right back into that match and started to probably play some of the snooker that I was used to playing, in the qualifying rounds. And, I narrowly lost. I lost 10-8. I do remember that. And
Mm.
I remember Neil coming to speak to me afterwards. And, again, he's a fantastic person, Neil Folds. And he came to console me, obviously, and said, all the best, and you're going to go a long way, that kind of thing. And yeah, so that was my first experience at the Crucible Theatre, and a memorable one.
And of course, once you've had that, you want to get back there as quickly as possible. But it took you a few years. And You actually played John Higgins in the final qualifying round in 1995, which to this day remains the last World Championship qualifying match that John Higgins has ever played. And he won three ranking events that season, but you nearly kept him away from the Crucible. You almost beat him. You only lost that one 10-8. But we'll come back to Higgins in a moment because
Mm.
you ended up playing him at the Crucible. Before that, though, surely your most famous Crucible match. In fact, maybe the most famous match of your whole career, Jason. First day of the 1996 World Championship. You've made it through for the second time. You're playing Stephen Hendry, who at that point had won it, well, 4 years in a row at that point and five times in all. And on the opening day, you had a substantial lead against him going into the last session.
Yeah, it's a match I remember well. I was up for it, that match. I was looking after myself. I was running a bit. I was keeping fit. I was everything that a snooker player should be. I think during that period, I was really dedicated and practicing hard. And I always remember somebody asking me, somebody in the press said, what do you think you've drawn Stephen Hendry? And I always remember giving some kind of answer to say, well, if I play my game, I can win. I'm not going there just to make the numbers up. I'm going there because I fancy the job. And I went there very positive. Started out pretty well in that match. Was 6-3 up. I do know that. And
Mm.
yeah, I was playing some good snooker around that time. Narrowly lost that game, but the thing I remember most about that game is just how annoying Stephen Hendry is because he just keeps potting all the balls all of the time. It's just not fair, is it? You know, he was unbelievable in the last session. He was winning frames from positions you just can't believe. He was scoring heavily in that match, and he really put up a fight to get back into the game. And I think I got behind in that match as well, Michael, and then eventually pulled it back. But I can remember the ball that really cost me, and there was a shot where I think I was bridging over the pack, or the balls were very close together, and it didn't quite reach the pocket. When you talk about fractions and margins,
Yeah,
snooker, we were talking about a millimeter difference in that match. If this ball drops, I'm probably going to go 9-8 in front at that point. And that's the kind of margins you're dealing with in professional sport.
and people might have looked at that and even look back at it now and just read the bare facts and say, oh, he was a young, inexperienced player who let Hendry off the hook. It wasn't like that at all. Hendry had four centuries in the match. He had a few other 80 plus breaks. So it wasn't just a case that he had an off day and you almost made him pay. He
Mm.
actually played really well across that match and produced a lot of very good stuff.
Yeah, yeah, he was an incredible player, really, and he was just so difficult to beat. And even when you felt like you were beating him, he would come back from nowhere. And we had a few tussles after that as well, and I lost
Mm.
narrowly to him in the UK Championship.
Yeah,
Um, I forget. I think that was decided, wasn't it? Was it 9-8?
yeah, it
Nine
was.
eight
He
two.
was world champion at the time. Yeah.
And I can tell you, I was 8-5 in front in that match.
Yes.
Be in
Yeah.
front on a couple of occasions. And again, how he ever won that match is beyond belief, really. But he was just a brilliant winner. He was just an out and out winner. He was just incredible, and you can't help but respect the sportsman in him and the fight that he had as a player. And when you think about the number of ranking events Stephen Hendry won and the number of events that were taking place on an annual basis, it is absolutely staggering, the way he kept winning. But I did get the better of him actually shortly after that. I think I beat him in I'm going to say it's the Welsh Open.
It was the Welsh, but
There
hold
you
that
go.
thought because
There
I
you
want to
go.
come back to that actually later on.
Yeah.
I'd like to just wrap up your Crucible story first, if we could, because it took you 4 years, as I said, to get back there for a second time, but then only 2 years to get back there for the third time. Now, you must have been thinking the draws aren't being kind to me because you draw Hendry in 96. In 98, you draw John Higgins just as he's replacing Hendry as the best player in the world. And again, a very eventful match. He went well in front, but you really came back and almost derailed what turned out to be his world championship winning campaign in the very first round.
Yes, that's right. It was definitely a match I could have won. I remember getting behind. Didn't start well in the game, and I remember the match and got right back into it. Again, fancied the job really, and I was playing snooker of a standard at the time where I could probably have gone on a lot further, and potentially been a ranking event winner if I'd have kept that dedication to just playing snooker. it was a tough match, and he got the better of me at the end. And fair play to him. He went on to win the world championship, and
Mm,
what a player he's turned out to be, by the way.
yeah. So great days at the Crucible, and you had a couple of last 16s at the Guildhall as well. And, you know, that was in the UK Championship. And, now you have a lot of tables at the UK. It's a different environment. Back then, if you were playing in the final stages of an event like that, there were only two tables. So there was a huge amount of spotlight on you. You really got to live out the dream that you'd had. You think of all the kids in the 80s who were watching the Crucible, the Guildhall, all these places thinking, I'd love to be center stage there someday. And you got to experience that on many occasions. That's a great career in itself.
Yeah, and I loved it as well. I loved playing. I loved the big occasions. I loved the Crucible. I loved the UK Championship. I loved the big events, and I just loved being out there, and I loved playing. And um, it was a great time, really. It was a great time, and like you say, fulfilling a dream, something that you've dreamt of doing all your life, playing on that small table in my front room with the TV on and watching the snooker while it was on, and dreaming that one day I could be a professional snooker player was everything. So it was a formidable time, really, in the sport. I think the only downside, the only negative I had was the lack of continued events. So as an amateur
Mm.
player, you didn't really have any downtime. If you lost on the Saturday, you go and find somewhere else to play on the Sunday. And I think I was playing 4 events a week at one stage as an amateur. When you turn professional, you were doing this 6, 7, 8 events per year. And there was a huge amount of downtime between each event. Now, that meant, yes, you could prepare and you could get back to the drawing board, but it also gave you too much thinking time, I think, sometimes. And I would have loved to been able to lose, if you lose in a match, I would love to go to another event the next week and come out fighting again. And that's what I always wanted, and actually was the main driver for me getting involved in the administration during my playing
Mm.
career, was to try and internationalize the sport.
We mentioned the Guildhall there and the UK Championship, and it was there that you actually got to the last 16 of a ranking event for the first time. Again, quite early on in your career. You'd only been a pro for about 2.5 years at that stage. And it was Darren Morgan who beat you in the last 16 of that UK. And it turned out to be the first of 10 times that you made it to the last 16 of ranking events. Now, I think we've talked about this before, Jason, that you weren't able to get past that. Last 16 turned out to be your longest run. You got there 10 times. Was it something that became a barrier after a while, that after you got to the last 16 a number of times and that was where the run kept on ending? Did that start getting in your head, and did that in itself make it harder to get any further?
I think it is about milestones, and I think I remember losing a match at the Guildhall actually to Quinton Hahn. Uh,
Yeah.
to be quite honest, they just couldn't possibly beat me at the time, and I let him get into my head actually, and his antics in that match were not very impressive, and it was it was a big milestone really to make the next match. And I guess now we look at players, it's like the 147 story, isn't it? When somebody makes 147 and then somebody else makes one, everybody else realizes they can make one. So there are mental barriers in sport to get over. We talk about women coming into the World Snooker Tour, and the women are now winning matches. There are barriers in everybody's head to get over. And nowadays, things like 147s are becoming more popular, and it's for me. Yes, it was a jump, but I think I'd also have to put it into context as time went on. I was doing other things. I had my own business. I was doing other things off the table, and I think perhaps over time that's what really stopped me progressing any further. But it was difficult to just play snooker with just 6, 7 events.
So that match you talked about against Quinton Han, you were 3-1 up in that, and he came back to win it 5-3. It turned out to be the last of those 10 last 16 appearances. But there was one barrier that you did manage to cross, and you alluded to it earlier. Not much more than a year after that defeat in the Grand Prix to Han, when, as you were saying, you did beat Stephen Hendry. You'd played him 5 times prior to that, Jason, and he'd won every time. But now, in the Welsh Open of 2000, right at the start of a new century, you faced him. He was still world champion at the time, and you managed to beat him on that occasion. So I'm guessing, was that the best win of your career?
Mentally it was a big thing for me. He'd beat me a few times, as you know, and I'd lost those matches. There was a couple of occasions where I should have won that match. I should have won that match in the UK, and I'd let him off.
Mm.
So it was a big mental barrier for me. For me, he was the best winner and the best player of all time in the sport at that time. And I wanted the scalp, if you know what I mean. I wanted to prove it to myself that I could win. And I do remember the last time he beat me before that, I said to my father, I said, Dad, I said, he will never beat me again. I promise, and after I'd won that match, I remember just being so pleased. I was actually pleased that I'd got over that milestone really. And unfortunately, I mean, I wasn't going to mention it, Stephen, if you are listening, but we did get to play again more recently on Stephen's Q-Tips program. And
Oh yeah.
yeah, so I've managed to keep my unbeaten record in the last two times I've played him.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because that actually turned out to be that match at the Welsh. It turned out to be the last time you ever played him as a pro. But you were still on the tour for another 4 years after that. But I guess everyone gets to that point, don't they, where they have a few years at the end where it's hard to get wins and you're not getting to venues. So what was that like for you, that part of your career?
I think frustrating, and I think as well, it was a turbulent political time at the WPBSA, and I was, an active director at the WPBSA, and I will say I was working for the company during that time. I served the company for almost 4 years as a volunteer, and one of the things was to try and work internationally and try and help build the sport. So I was really interested in my work actually, even though I was working as a volunteer at WPSA, I was really into it, but it definitely took me away from practicing, and I definitely wasn't putting the time in during that period. So it was frustrating. It was becoming frustrating turning up and not playing well and not winning matches. But you can only look at yourself at that point and ask why and try and put that right if that's the direction you're going to go in. So yeah, I ended really my career prematurely. A lot of players that went through at similar time to me are still playing, and it was a time where I made the decision to make the change. I had a young family at home, and your priorities change in life, and I made a jump. And in many ways, it was nice to come back to the sport actually, and be back involved with it again.
And I guess it made it easier in a way to sign off from the professional tour and the life you'd known for so long, because you were in a different situation to a lot of players who finish their pro career. They know they're not going to be going back to it, and then they think, okay, well, what happens next? But the fact that you knew there were other things for you to do in life and things that you wanted to pursue and roads you wanted to go down, I guess that eased it a bit, that it wasn't just the end of one story. You were also very much at the beginning of another phase.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I'd started, I'd got involved in a business in automotive parts distribution, which was something that was I'd got involved with in my town, and I got involved in that for a while, and so I had things to fall back on, and I had an interest as well in politics, and I think again my father's interest, influence in that, he would follow politics on a Sunday, and we'd watch, the political channels, sat eating our dinners, and it was it was something that again I got interested in, and it was there were things to do. My life was full actually. I had children, I had things to do, I had projects to get on with, and it wasn't like you stop and wonder what you're going to do. I knew what I was going to do next. My problem was fitting everything in, I guess. So it was a natural thing to happen that something had to give, and of course, not performing in snooker meant that that was the obvious choice really.
So you got involved in local politics and became mayor. It's not exactly a well-worn path for snooker players, but what was that experience like?
I absolutely loved it. I mean, I loved my community work. I've always done a lot of voluntary work in my life, and actually, I mean, a lot of people won't know this. Despite being ridiculously busy, I'm still doing it now, and I've still got endless charities that we're doing things with, and it's it. I think everybody needs to give a bit back into society, and so getting involved in local politics was an obvious route, and there was a group of people in my town who were a little bit more entrepreneurial than they were more entrepreneurial than politicians, if you know what I mean. They were business people, and there was a little group of us that got together, and we did some incredible projects actually as a whilst I was a councillor, and things like the regeneration of a mining town was something that we got involved in, and have actually went on to win the Royal Town Planning Award for most enterprising zone in Britain, believe it or not. Um, And yeah, and they made me the mayor of the town, which was fabulous, really. I mean, took it seriously. And the next step really was probably for me to stay in politics, and that's where I was going. And the obvious route was probably to run for MP for Newark and Sherwood, which wasn't that far away that what I was doing. So it was yeah, another big change came in my life really, and the phone rang one day.
Yeah, and I'm guessing that was what led you back to the WPBSA. And you'd had an experience there before where you'd been very high up in the administration, but at a very, very different time. And it was always firefighting. There wasn't a great atmosphere around. The game was stagnating a bit. When you came back into it then, it was a very different role you were coming back into, and with Barry Hearn now in charge of things and everything moving forward, a much more positive experience. And I guess for someone like you who wants to be doing things, all the frustrations of your previous attempts to improve the game were now gone, and everything was positive and progress.
Yeah, it was a golden opportunity really, and I sort of recognised straight away that there was an opportunity here to almost handpick a team and start to put things around the table that could make a real difference. We tried to commercialise the commercial arm years before, and great attempts had been made to do that, and by no means criticising my predecessors here. But years before I had started working in Asia, I had a real passion to think that snooker had a real stronghold in Asia, and it was actually quite small at the time. And we started that work with China and Thailand and some of the other nations. I knew Wattener, of course, from my younger days, and started a little project in Thailand to build an academy for Asian countries. And there were over 30 countries that were sending players. There were only a few players around then, and one of those players was Ding Junhui. He was a player from China, which nobody knew. And it kind of that for me, I had a real passion for international development for the sport. So when I left, I kind of left that, and there was a great sense of unfinished business. But to come back and say, if you take over the WPSA, what would you do with it? And that was the kind of question. And Barry and I, along with other members of that team, sat down and worked out how we thought the sport could grow exponentially. And the one thing that had happened is a number of people in Asia had asked me to go back into that direction. So I set off in that direction, and it's something I've been very passionate about building, trying to globalize the sport around the world. I'm a development person, not the commercial contracting person, but I'm a development person where we go out, find opportunities, build things on the ground, and build the sport from the bottom up. And that's been a success in China. We built the sport from the bottom up, not the top down. And you can see the sheer scale of the sport now. So yeah, great sense of unfinished business, a great time to come back with passion to do that. And I was actually still the mayor of my town while I was working at the WPBSA. Again, just came in for a few days a month to start with, and I eventually stepped down as mayor and stepped down as a councillor completely because I was starting to get really busy at the WPBSA. And as you know, it's taken over my life.
Yeah, and there are all kinds of things that go on now that just didn't exist sort of 20, 30 years ago, whatever. One thing that has been around for a long time is talk of trying to get snooker into the Olympics, but I'm not sure in the past whether it was really pursued in a proper way. But you have been so committed to that and you've never let go of that vision. Where are we at, Jason? Are we getting any closer to it happening?
Well, it is something I would love to see. I would love to see that that happen. And it's not just about getting in the Olympics. It's about what it can do to the sport. I understand the sports business very well, and I understand sport development. I understand how Olympic committees work, how governments work, how medal hopes work. And it's a global system. What you have is a system where if athletes have the opportunity to earn gold medals for their country, you have incredible resources in those countries to build the sport itself. And that's something that we are tapping into it a little bit, but I would love to see us treated like an Olympic sport all over the world, where every snooker player that ever picks up a cue can go through a system and get right to the very top, and that system be there and be sustainable. Whereas now we're working so hard on all these systems to maintain pathways to the tour, to keep the coaching going, keep the development going, keep the training going. It could grow exponentially if the Olympics was on the horizon. For me, it was a passion I'd got involved in very early on. It was about the year 2000. I was given this project, and by 2001, we'd taken snooker to the very first World Games in Akita in
Mm.
Japan. And for me, that was a great moment. I walked out into an Olympic stadium in Japan carrying a banner which had snooker and billiards on it. And I was with Sintupul Siravong, who was the head of the Thai Association and actually had served the WPBSA for a while and was responsible for the Thai ranking events in the old days. And I'll never forget it to this day. He held my hand in that arena and he said, Jason, you have to stay and you have to take this project forward. He said, this is the day that sport, that said, this is the day that snooker became a sport. And he was right. It was the day snooker got treated like a sport rather than a game and a recreation. And it changed our stars, I think, that week. So to come back, that project was picked up. We delivered the World Games as part of the World Confederation of Billiard Sports to Wroclaw, and that was a successful event. And then, a little bit of political fallout got involved, and other Q sports are involved as well. And the project has kind of sat on the shelf since the Paris bid. We got very close on the Paris bid, but it does a lot of political persuasion. It needs a lot of people lined up. Brisbane, for me, is the only realistic hope on the horizon of snooker in the Olympic Games. I think LA is too many American competitive sports. Brisbane, we've got infrastructure on the ground, we've got infrastructure in Australia. For me, that is a golden opportunity, and we are having some discussions now about what that looks like in terms of a bid. To be honest, I would love to have the opportunity to drive a bid forward for those games. That bid currently sits with the World Confederation of Billiard Sports, which is snooker, pool, and carom.
You're an administrator now, but as we've discussed primarily, Jason, in the past, you were a player. And just reminiscing with you all on this here today, it occurs to me once again that I always think snooker is very different to other sports in one particular way, that there are people who can be very heavily involved in other sports, but then drift away from them and their passion seems to go. With real snooker people, it never seems to leave them, does it? It gets under the skin and it never really goes from you. And I think that applies more in our sport than in most others. And it really seems to be true of you.
I totally agree with you, Michael. We're all on a piece of elastic to this sport. We might go away, but we will come bouncing back. And it's just the way it is. It's in the blood, and it's in the passion of the work. It's in the passion when you're playing. You just can't get away from it. It's very addictive. It's addictive when you watch it. It's addictive when you play it. It's a fascinating sport. The one thing I would say is, and it's something that we've delivered through our player education. Snooker players come through from snooker clubs, sometimes have a good career, and then perhaps some drift away, but some go on to do great things. And snooker players don't realize what they're capable of. They are finely tuning their brains every day, technically, mentally, and they have no idea what they are capable in life after sport. And I think snooker, I love serving the players at the WPBSA. I love seeing them all do well. I love to see the sport growing, and I also love to see people go on and continue to have good lives afterwards.
I will finish, Jason, by granting you one wish. One day, as a snooker player, nothing to do with your administration, one day from your playing career that you would love to repeat and just relive and enjoy the experience again, what would you go for?
31st of May 1990, the day I turned professional.
Yeah.
It was the height of everything that you'd worked for as a child, and it meant so much. And to see family and friends around that day, it's very emotional, really.
Yeah, it's funny you say that actually, because I often find that with people who've had hugely successful sports careers, but they still say the best day of it was the day it all began and the day they turned pro. And likewise for you, Jason. And it would have been impossible, to stay in the role you're in for as long as you have without having enjoyed the sort of regard within the game, which can only be earned over time. But long before you were known as chairman, you did have a playing career to remember, and it's been great reflecting on it all with you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Michael.
And thanks to all of you as well for listening. We'll see you again very soon on the WPBSA official podcast. Bye-bye.